Picture this, a real estate listing with no photos of the outside, because outside is the problem. A town with no shadows at noon, because there's nothing tall enough to cast one. A cemetery that the government won't let you visit, in a place the government won't even put on the map anymore. Right now, in this country, thousands of people are living in towns that everyone else agreed to give up on. Not because they had no choice, because they chose it. They looked at the cities, the auctions, the 6-month rental wait lists, the mortgage repayments swallowing half a paycheck, and they drove the other way. So here's the question I want you to sit with for the next 20 minutes. What does it actually take to break a person's attachment to comfort? Because by the time we reach the first town on this list, you're going to understand exactly why some people would rather live somewhere the sun tries to kill them than spend one more year in a place that's merely expensive. This is a countdown through 12 of the most rejected settlements on the Australian continent. And one of them, the locals will tell you, isn't rejected at all. We start somewhere that looks on the surface like the opposite of abandonment. Yulara is manicured. It's air-conditioned. It has a 5-star hotel with a pool shaped like a boomerang. And that's precisely the problem. Yulara was never allowed to become a town in the way Coober Pedy or Marri became towns. Organically, messily, by accident. It was built in the 1980s as a resort enclosure, planted several kilometres back from Uluru, specifically so tourists wouldn't see the accommodation from the rock. Everyone who lives there works there. There's no other reason to be within 100 kilometres of the place. Housing is tied to employment contracts. Lose the job, lose the roof over your head in the same week. Ask a local how long they plan to stay and you'll get an answer measured in seasons, not years. It's a town built for other people's holidays, staffed by residents who are, in a strange way, just as transient as the tourists they're serving drinks to. There's a particular kind of loneliness in living somewhere spectacular that was never meant to be yours. Now travel southwest into a stretch of desert the government decided, decades ago, that ordinary people shouldn't be allowed to wander through unsupervised. Wilcannia was built to test rockets and missiles during the Cold War, and even today you need a level of clearance most people will never bother obtaining just to look around properly. Here's what nobody tells you about Wilcannia. It's frozen in time in the most unsettling way. Mid-century houses, a cinema that hasn't updated its signage since the Menzies government. A population that used to number in the thousands, now scraped down to a few hundred, rattling around infrastructure built for a town 10 times its size. And here's the sharp left turn. Just beyond the prohibited area sits Maralinga, where the British detonated nuclear weapons on Aboriginal land throughout the 1950s. That's not incidental colour, that's the neighbourhood. Wilcannia isn't merely remote. It's a settlement that exists specifically because the rest of the country agreed this was somewhere dangerous, things could happen without anyone watching. Follow the map, east now, out along Cooper Creek to a town that has already died once. Inaminka was a thriving river port in the 1870s. Then it collapsed, was abandoned, sat empty for decades, and was eventually resurrected as a tiny outpost servicing cattle stations and the odd Outback tourist. This is the spot where Burke and Wills starved to death within reach of help that never arrived, a fact the locals mention with the same casualness you'd use to point out a good coffee shop. The population today numbers in the dozens. When the Cooper floods, which it does unpredictably, the town turns into an island, cut off from the highway network entirely. You have to ask, what kind of person moves to a place named, essentially, for its own historical catastrophe? The answer, it turns out, is someone who finds a strange comfort in the unpredictability. When your closest neighbour is 90 minutes away, you stop worrying about the things that keep city dwellers awake at night, and you start worrying about whether the river's coming up. Now we go somewhere the roads simply stop. Flinders Island sits in the Bass Strait, between Tasmania and the mainland, reachable only by light aircraft or a ferry that keeps its own opinion about the weather. It carries a brutal history. It was where the last of Tasmania's Aboriginal population were forcibly relocated in the 1830s, and much of that suffering is still written into the landscape if you know where to look. Groceries here cost more. Medical emergencies mean a plane, not an ambulance. And yet the population, small as it is, has held remarkably steady for years, largely farmers, fishers, and a handful of people who arrived for a holiday and simply never organised the return trip. Here's the quiet trade nobody advertises. Total isolation in exchange for a night sky so undisturbed by artificial light that you can watch satellites cross it in real time. For some people, that trade is obviously worth it. For most Australians, it would feel like a life sentence. Back onto the mainland, halfway up the Stuart Highway, sits a town that gets discussed in Canberra almost exclusively in terms of the statistics it would rather not be known for. Unemployment, overcrowded housing, and a cost of living that punishes anyone without a mining wage. But strip away the spreadsheet for a second and look at what Tennant Creek actually is, a genuine crossroads. A place where road trains, grey nomads, gold prospectors and generations of Warramungu families all intersect on the same stretch of bitumen. The gold rush that built the town in the 1930s is long gone, but the mining company housing stock it left behind still shapes who can afford to live where. This is where the highway junction towns start revealing their pattern to you. They're not built for beauty. They're built because a truck needed fuel, a train needed water, or a prospector needed a pub. The town grows up around the function, and the people arrive afterward, almost as an afterthought. Speaking of afterthoughts, Oodnadatta holds the record for the hottest temperature ever recorded in Australia, and residents will recite that number the way other towns brag about a football premiership. It sits along the old Ghan railway line, a route abandoned decades ago, in favour of a track further west, which means Oodnadatta lost its entire reason for existing and simply refused to accept the verdict. The population hovers around 100 people. The pub, the pink roadhouse, painted the exact shade its name suggests, functions as the town hall, the petrol station, the tourist office, and, some days, the entire local economy in one building. There's something almost defiant about a settlement that keeps existing purely on stubbornness after the infrastructure that justified it has been ripped up and moved elsewhere. Nobody chooses Oodnadatta by accident. You choose it because leaving would mean admitting the desert one. Further along that same Oodnadatta track sits Maree, the old junction where the narrow gauge railway once split, one line heading to the far north, the other out toward the Birdsville track. Both lines are gone now, torn up, replaced by four-wheel drive routes that flood without warning. Maree's population sits under 100, and it's built almost entirely from people whose grandparents were Afghan cameliers, brought here in the 19th century to run supply trains across the desert on camelback. A piece of history most Australians never learn in school, sitting quietly in a town most Australians will never visit. And here's a genuine curiosity worth sitting with for a second. Not far from Maree, carved into the Jibba Plains, is the Maree Man, a colossal geoglyph the size of several football fields, and nobody has ever conclusively proven who made it or why. A 570-metre mystery, sitting in a landscape most people assume is empty. Isolation, it turns out, doesn't mean nothing happens. It means nobody's watching when it does. Now for something with a genuinely different flavour. On Opal Field, with almost no formal governance at all, Lightning Ridge runs on a version of mining law so old and so specific to the opal trade that newcomers are given a nickname, New Chums, and a fairly blunt warning, dig somewhere else is already claimed, and you'll find out exactly how informal the dispute resolution process is out here. People from more than 50 different countries have tried their luck in these fields, living in caravans, dugouts, and tin sheds perched over shafts that plunge 30 metres into black opal-bearing rock. Most find nothing. A handful find enough opal in a single afternoon to retire. That gamble, total ruin against instant wealth, with almost nothing in between, is the entire economic logic of the town, and somehow, generation after generation, people keep taking the bet. There is no council rezoning meeting standing between a miner and a hole in the ground here. That absence of rules is exactly the appeal and exactly the danger. Old mine shafts, unmarked and uncapped, are scattered through the scrub like traps nobody bothered removing. Freedom, in Lightning Ridge, comes with a very literal drop beneath your feet. If Lightning Ridge is anarchy, Roxby Downs is its precise opposite. A company town built from scratch in the 1980s to service the Olympic Dam mine, one of the largest uranium, copper and gold deposits on the planet. Everything here was planned. The streets, the housing, the shopping centre, all constructed on a schedule dictated by a mining company's production targets rather than any organic sense of community. Wages are high. So is the churn. Workers rotate through on contracts, often flying in from Adelaide for a fortnight at a time, sleeping in accommodation that was purpose-built to be comfortable and somehow still feels temporary, because it is. This is corporate isolation rather than geographic isolation, a town that exists entirely at the pleasure of a resource price on a global commodities market. When copper and uranium prices climb, Roxby Downs booms. When they fall, the town holds its breath. Few settlements in this country have their entire fate tied so directly to a number on a screen in a Sydney trading room they never see. Now picture red dirt hills carved open decade after decade by one of the largest mining operations in the Southern Hemisphere. Lead, zinc, copper and silver pulled out of the ground since the 1920s and smelted right there in town, close enough that the smokestack dominates the skyline like a monument. Mount Isa is no ghost town. Nearly 20,000 people call it home, and by Outback standards, it's practically a metropolis with its own hospital, its own rodeo, its own reputation as the unofficial capital of the entire Northwest. But that industrial heart comes with a cost written into the soil itself. Studies of lead exposure among children in Mount Isa have gone on for years, tracing contamination back to decades of smelter emissions settling into backyards and playgrounds. So here's the trade this town makes out loud every single day: genuine economic opportunity, real wages, a real community. Purchased at the price of a heavy metal that doesn't leave when you tell it to. Ask a long-term resident whether they'd move, and plenty will say no without hesitation. Ask them whether they worry about what's in the dust, and the answer gets a lot quieter. And now the town that earns its place near the very bottom of this list for a reason, unlike any other entry here. Because Wittenoom isn't merely unloved, it's forbidden. Blue asbestos was mined here from the 1930s through the 1960s. And more than 2,000 former residents and workers have since died from the diseases that dust caused: asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, with the toll still climbing decades after the mine itself shut down. The Western Australian government stripped Wittenoom's name from official maps and road signs in 2007. Electricity was cut, mail delivery ended, and still, a handful of residents refused to leave, clinging to houses in a town the state had legally declared unfit for any form of human occupation, until the very last of them was finally relocated years later, and the remaining buildings were bulldozed. Think about that for a moment. People stayed in a place their own government was actively trying to erase from existence because it was still, somehow, home. That's not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. That's something closer to grief, a refusal to let go of a place even after the place itself had become lethal. And now, finally, the twist this whole list has been building toward. Coober Pedy sits in the middle of an opal mining moonscape in Outback, South Australia, where summer temperatures regularly climb past 50 degrees Celsius, and the ground is so riddled with old mine shafts that wandering off the marked paths after dark is genuinely dangerous. Roughly half the town's residents don't live above ground at all. They live in dugouts, homes carved directly into the hillsides, holding a steady, comfortable temperature all year round without a single air conditioner running. By almost every measure that matters to a real estate agent, Coober Pedy should be near the top of any list of towns Australia has given up on. It ranks among the more socioeconomically disadvantaged local government areas in the entire state. Youth disengagement is high. Internet access is patchy at best. The opal industry that built the town has been steadily declining for years, with fewer young miners willing to take on the physical risk and financial uncertainty of chasing gemstones underground. And yet, ask the people who actually live there, and you get something you didn't hear once. Not from a single previous entry on this list: genuine, uncomplicated affection. More than 45 nationalities have settled in this one small town since the opal rush after the Second World War, and they didn't just tolerate the place. They built an entire underground culture around it. Churches carved into rock, a bookstore with no windows, a bar where the walls glitter faintly with veins of unmined opal. Residents describe the silence of a dugout home, the complete absence of wind rattling through it, as one of the most peaceful sounds or non-sounds they've ever experienced. So here's the reversal. Every other town on this list survives despite rejection, worn down by isolation, tolerated rather than adored. Coober Pedy is the one place where the harshness and the affection aren't fighting each other at all. The heat, the underground silence, the moonscape above, locals don't endure that. They point to it as the reason they'll never leave. 12 towns. 12 different reasons the rest of the country looked away. A toxic mine the government tried to erase from the map. A resort built for other people's holidays. An oval field with no rule book. And a company town that lives and dies by a commodity price on a screen somewhere in Sydney. And underneath every single one of them, the same argument keeps surfacing. The cities offer comfort, but they charge for it. In housing prices that eat half a wage. In regulation that governs which colour you're allowed to paint your own French door. In a kind of crowded conformity that some people simply cannot stomach for one more year. These 12 towns offer the opposite deal. Total freedom, bought at the cost of nearly everything else. Most people would never take that trade. And that's exactly why the ones who do end up somewhere the rest of us will only ever see in a video like this one. So here's my question for you. And I actually want an answer in the comments below. Not a joke, not a one-liner. If civilization genuinely wasn't an auction anymore, which of these 12 towns would you choose? The opal silence of Coober Pedy? The stubborn defiance of Unadada? Or something further out than all of them that we haven't even covered yet?